Determine the slope and the y-intercept of the graph of the equation y equals negative 3x. Then use the slope and y-intercept to graph the equation by hand. Now let's look carefully at this equation that they've given us here. Y equals negative 3x. So I'm seeing something that's sort of looking familiar. Remember, we've been talking in this section about slope-intercept form. Y equals mx plus b. That's our slope-intercept form of a linear equation. And this equation that we're given is looking pretty similar. I see the y there by itself equals negative 3x. But the problem is this piece seems to be missing. I'm not seeing plus anything or minus anything. And so we have to think about, well, so does that mean this really isn't in slope-intercept form, or what's going on with the missing b? And what's true is that the b isn't really missing. The b is just invisible. Think about adding some number to something. What number could we add that in fact doesn't change anything? And in fact, it doesn't change it, so we typically wouldn't even bother to show it that we were adding this particular number. And if you can solve that puzzle, that's going to lead you to the fact that what we have here is plus 0. Plus 0 doesn't change anything. So typically we wouldn't even bother to show it. But here, if we're looking for the slope and the y-intercept of the graph of this equation, we need to know that that plus 0 is sitting there, even though we don't see it. So that's going to help me to name my y-intercept and my slope, because that's part of what the problem is asking us to do here. So determine the slope. So the slope for this problem is negative 3. And the y-intercept, well, remember the y-intercept, that always is part, this where this b comes from, that my y-intercept is always going to be 0, b, whatever that b value is. Well, in this case, that b value is 0. So my y-intercept is going to be 0, 0. That invisible 0 that was added on there. So now we've determined the slope and the y-intercept, and now we want to use those to graph this equation by hand. So let's start by plotting the y-intercept. That's always where we start with these problems, is by looking at where the y-intercept is. In this particular problem, the y-intercept is going to be right at the origin. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to put a point right there at the origin. Now my slope is negative 3. I'm going to bring that down here. So remember that m represents the slope. That's how we knew the slope was negative 3, because that's what's in the m position right here. And remember, with the slope, the x is not part of the slope. It's only the number that comes in front of the x. It doesn't include the x. So our slope is negative 3. But since we want our slope to give us information about rise and run, rise over run, we're going to want our slope to look like a fraction. And we can do that by putting it over 1. Any integer number I can put over 1 to make it look like a fraction. So now I can use my y-intercept as my starting point. In that case, that happens to be the origin. From my y-intercept, I'm going to rise negative 3, and I'm going to run 1. And remember, we're going to run a positive 1. Sometimes actually writing that plus sign in there can be really helpful, just to remind yourself that for the run, I need to move in the positive direction. So from the y-intercept, we're going to rise negative 3, 1, 2, 3, and we're going to run positive 1. So that's going to put a point right there. Then we're going to do that again. We're going to rise negative 3, so that means we go down 3, 1, 2, 3, and we run positive 1, so that means that we're moving to the right 1. And that gives us 3 nice points to line up our straight edge with. So let's grab the straight edge and bring it on down. And we're going to line up our straight edge with one of our points. This is just like you would do by hand. And then we're going to rotate the straight edge so it lines up right with those other points just like that, and try to be as accurate as you can be. And now we just grab our pencil and draw our line through those points. Whoops, kind of got off of my line there a little bit. Let me just erase that so I can get back on. There we go. So we're done with our straight edge now, so we can get rid of that. Delete that. And then we're going to finish by putting arrows onto our line to remind us that this line continues beyond my pencil mark. It goes forever and ever in both directions. So there's the graph of this equation, y equals negative 3x.